So next year, when we're getting ready to start the season opener in the NFL, it may be the debut opening weekend of one Caleb Willaims, who is projected to be the number one pick in the NFL draft out of USC. He's the favorite to win the Heisman for a second consecutive year. He's got all the goods. Everybody's looking at him like he's a Trevor Lawrence or, an Andrew Luck, like that sort of ilk that he keeps company with as he gets ready for his NFL career. But him and his father did a lengthy interview with GQ, a sit-down. Very interesting pictures of Caleb Willaims as well, too. Very stylish. A lot of stuff in that GQ article that was, the painted nails, all that stuff. And his father brought up something that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on because you guys would have direct knowledge of this in your time in the NFL. He said, quote, "The funky thing about the NFL draft process is Caleb would almost be better off not being drafted than being drafted first. The system is completely backwards. The way the system is constructed, you go to the worst possible situation, the worst possible team, the worst organization in the league because of their desire for parity. Gets the first pick. So it's the gift and the curse. I mean, I've talked to Archie Manning. His career was shot because he went to a horrible organization. I've talked to Lincoln Riley and Kyler Murray. They struggled because of where he was drafted. Baker Mayfield struggled mightily because of where he was drafted. The organizations mattered. They asked him, would you consider not sending Caleb to the NFL if he was in a bad situation, potentially with a team picking number one overall? And he talked about it being, quote, it's got two shots at the apple, so if there's not a good situation, the truth is he can come back to school, end quote. Is he wrong?
No, he's not wrong. And Caleb Willaims happens to be that type of player who's in the position now with NIL to truly be able to come back to school. And yes, he'll take a hit because he won't be making that life-changing money like you'll make as the first overall pick of an NFL draft, but he can still make millions. And he probably will, if he comes back, make millions. Here's the crazy thing about the draft process, because his dad is really ultimately speaking for Caleb. I'm sure Caleb feels this way, but if he says it, he gets a bad rep. But if his dad says it, it's just a dad who's talking in a very common sense, logical manner and pointing something out that not many people have addressed. So here's my issue with the draft process. It serves only the league. And this is what doesn't make any sense about it to me, because it's designed and created for parity. So the worst team in the league gets the first overall pick. So if you want, you can tank and you can get Caleb Willaims, and then you can turn things immediately around. Well, you'd hope that'd be the case, right? If you've got an owner who knows what he's doing, if you have an owner who wants to put resources and assets into that franchise to make it competitive. That's a big if. And so because the draft process is really set up for parity of the league to make the league competitive, it really doesn't have the best interest of the player at mind, which up until this point in time in your life as a football player, you have always had a choice of where you go. You could choose where you want to go to play high school football. You could choose where you want to go to play college football. And then all of a sudden you get thrown into a draft process that really serves parity amongst the league. And I'm going to go a step further and say this, and this might get me in trouble. The way the draft process is set up, and really the league in general, it's set up to allow bad ownership to continue to exist. And you want to know why? Because it protects those bad owners by rewarding them for being cheap and being crappy at being able to manage an organization by giving them some of the top talented players coming out of college football, or the chance at least to draft them, right? And that to me doesn't make any flipping sense. If I was Jerry Jones, if I was any other, one of the biggest owners you want to talk about in the league, I would say we should be having a snake draft. This shouldn't be a reward for poor performance the year before. Because here's the reality of it. We have a process now designed where we're trying to create parity through the draft. and we still don't have parity. Bad organizations are still bad organizations. Like this year, I've got a lot of optimism and hope for the Browns because they finally built up this roster and they have all these pieces. You're hoping that they're going to make it. And if they don't, they're probably going to change their head coach. There's probably someone who's going to take the fall for it, right? And I'm not saying Jimmy Haslam's a bad owner. He hasn't owned the team that long. But when I got there, they didn't know what they were doing as far as ownership standpoint. And that wasn't a fault. That team was inherited by Mr. Lerner, and a lot of times it's tough because when your dad does something and you try to run the company after him, and you try to run an organization after him, it's hard to do it like he did it, and it's hard to be able to have as much passion for it the way he did. So the reality is the draft process allows bad ownership to really maintain because this league is so lucrative, but because it also helps to create more parity. If you look at the English Premier League, which I think as we see college football start to take shape, you start to realize it's a much better process. Like a snake draft, which is a randomly assorted draft, which is honestly what you should push for. So in one round, right, it would just be randomly assorted. And we don't know who gets the pick, but whoever gets it, they get that pick. And then it would go in the reverse order for the next round.
Yeah.
And then it keeps going kind of back and forth with the way you go about drafting. And you would hope that you'd want it completely random so that you couldn't scheme your way into stinking for a year to then get the number one overall pick. That's why the NBA is a draft lottery. So I think this is it's awesome that Caleb's dad's brought this up to bring attention to it, because it's one thing that, in my opinion, it's designed to help keep parity within the league. And if we're being honest with ourselves, there's 8, maybe 10 teams that can win a Super Bowl this year that we'd point to. And you might say, well, hey, they got those guys via the draft. But if you're talking about, like, for example, the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes was the number one overall pick. There was mixed reviews on that. It happened to be the Chiefs were the ones that took the chance to take him. Same thing with the Buffalo Bills taking Josh Allen. So, like, as much as people want to talk about, like, it helps this, or it got, the Bengals Joe Burrow. Yeah, in the case of Joe Burrow, it did. But there's other instances where that wasn't the case. And it's because good organizations know what they're doing, how to evaluate talent, how to pick certain players, then surround them with talent and the right pieces. And even with the way the draft is set up, we still don't have parity in the league.
You've seen so many careers go to the wasteland because of this conversation. And it's always just one of those things. It is a blessing and a curse, but in the end, it's the reality too. The reality is that it
doesn't have to be the reality, though.
It doesn't.
The league chooses to be this way.
That's what it is. I mean, that is the reality, is that they've chosen to do it this way. I mean, it's just interesting. You get to choose all the way up until you go pro. Like, you get to deliberate, weigh it out, measure it. This could be a great place to live. This could be a great place to get educated. This is along the lines of what my belief systems represent, whatever foundational components of character, so on and so forth. But when you go pro, if you're good, you don't get to choose. But it's interesting when you think about the fact that you want to be chosen. You want to do well enough to be chosen. Like, it's not very often where a guy's like, I'm hitting for being a number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 draft pick. I don't want to go to any of those teams. Like, of course you don't want to go to a bad team, but at the same time, you want to be the number 1 overall pick. You want to be a top 5 pick. You want to be a top 10 pick. In the end, you're getting a job that's going to pay you a ton of money, and your draft position has a lot to do with your ability to create financial stability. So I guess it all comes down to what the priorities of how you feel heading into doing what you do at the college level so well that you're heading towards the distinction of being one of those type of top prospects.
Because I could still be one of those top prospects, though, in a different way of sorting out the draft.
Yeah. I mean, listen, and I know Caleb's dad. He's a businessman. He's a pretty dope dude. When you raise these types of topics, it sometimes it can become a tad bit offensive to people. it could come off across as maybe he's too involved. Like, the question was, are you going to let him play? Well, Caleb's a grown-ass man. So I don't know that it's a matter of what you're going to let him do. Now, if you're advising him and, you guys are talking it through, that's different. I mean, I ain't really care for the wording of it. But, I mean, Archie brought up Archie Manning in the conversation. Archie didn't allow Eli to go to the Chargers. He didn't, it's the number one pick.
That's probably he was probably the only family, I wouldn't say only, but one of the only
that would be able to get away with it.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah,
get away with it.
And because you also have to have someone who's financially affluent enough to be able to say, hey, we're willing to sit out another year and then revisit this a year from now. And deal with that, right? Like, there's not a lot of players, families who are in that position in the first place who could have that sort of leverage, or who know the NFL and the league circles like that.
Yeah.
So it's all I'm saying is, if you did a completely randomized draft, what you're saying is still true. The top players would still go in those top spots for the most part. I mean, maybe there's a team that ends up getting the number one overall pick that doesn't need it, and now you've got another team that needs to trade draft picks in order to do so. But what I'm trying to point out is, it's not set up to be able to help bring along the bottom tier teams or bad ownership. And instead,
they just waste them.
It's going to only it's only going to provide the opportunity to give everyone an opportunity or a chance at getting some of the top talented players. Which, if you think about it, like, that's how you'd want it to be. You want it to be equal.
I mean, but
like,
you just
do we want it to be slanted in such a way for bad ownership to help bring them along? Or do we want it to be equal and fair amongst everyone? But isn't that what everyone pushes for now?
Like, think about if you went to, I don't know, during your time, think about if you went to the Steelers and you became the starting quarterback for the Steelers.
Well, and that's the hard thing that, like, his dad's touching on is, especially for quarterbacks, like, first impressions are everything. Like, Baker because he mentioned Baker's name in it, and Baker goes to the Browns, and he's the guy, and he takes them to the playoffs, and they get a win versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then after that, it's like they can't come to a long-term contract agreement. He plays banged up through a year. They don't have a great year. He's gone. And now he's trying to find himself throughout a league where he's been to Carolina, he's been to LA Rams, now he's in Tampa. And that's the unfortunate part, is his talent and ability will always get him another opportunity, but everyone looks at him, they're like, yeah, but these are the reasons why we can't sign him now.
That you have to wear the title, the scarlet letter of B on your chest because of being great in college.
And the reality is like, I don't know what did or did not happen during this time there. Only he knows and the organization knows. I know from my time what it was like there. And I know from my experience, like, getting to other places where you're like, damn, would have been nice to be drafted here. Like, the resources and the things they put around rookies and the things they provide their players and the way they go about handling and putting players in, it's entirely different. And you can see why they're a winning organization, or you can see why they're a championship organization, because how they go about addressing issues or facing adversity. They don't panic. They don't make irrational decisions. Like, they have a process of doing it.
That's the part. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, you see the difference between these different franchises, and you go, yeah. Like, if we're being real about it, the difference of separation between certain players and other players, it's not as much as people think on the outside. That's why any team can beat any team on any given Sunday. Like, we always say that. And the betting lines kind of get skewed sometimes because of that. But when you're in the right situation to go flourish and go play and all that, man, it plays a huge part in your ability to be successful. And this isn't specific to football. I mean, imagine if you're the top student coming out of MIT and you go to a crappy organization. Is that really utilizing that kid's skill set? No, and he doesn't have to be drafted into that. He's going to be able to go to a top-tier tech company where he can go excel and he can go maybe start his own company one day and all that, where he can have that opportunity. It's like nowhere else in the world do we have a process set up where you enter into employment
where you go to potentially the
A
worst team or one
deal.
of the worst teams.
That's
Based off of how good you achieve. That is crazy. I'm at the top of my class. Yeah, you're going to the worst company.
And your reputation is tied to the bag of crap
You're a bust.
that you got taken with. Like, look at
how are you able to get such great grades in college, my guy? You're a bust for us.
look at Josh Rosen, top 10 pick. He got part of a season in Arizona, and then he was scapegoated out.
There's so many names, bro.
With his head coach. And you look back at his – I don't even think Josh Rosen's in the league right now. He's 26 years old. He got 13 starts. He got no shot. There was no opportunity for him. And we just look at him and go, oh, yeah, another guy that didn't work. Bust, failure, his fault.
And it'd
he
be
got
every
drafted
year.
to crap.
Look how – here's my – you're going to find me today. Look at Washington. That's an entire, 20 years? 20-some years of just effing up every single draft. And even though you'll say, okay, a guy like Sean Taylor, we got Sean out of it. You got a Chris Samuels out of it. And there's a few times you'll say, all right, there's a few guys that get drafted and you're like, you know what, we got a good one. But it's a door prize. It's a going home prize, right? We got a good player in the draft.
Well, the reality is those good players would be good players anywhere.
Right. Well, they would be great players somewhere else.
They'd be great players somewhere else.
They would be great because the results would go with what they're doing. Like your efforts aren't going unnoticed because your team is winning.
It would be kind of funny if Arizona had the number 1 pick and Caleb Williams' dad is like, no, we're not going to Arizona. So they come back for another year. And lo and behold, Arizona's picking number 1 overall next year.
Again.
All right.
I mean, I was gonna say contractually it's set up better to be able to have that number 1 pick 2 years from now with the Kyler Murray deal than obviously after this year. We're being real.
Arizona's like, all right, no problem. Yeah, we'll wear it for another year.
It's just it's interesting because I mean, look, I can personally relate to this and. I remember after I got drafted, my dad said something to me, and I'm not going to say what he said, but I remember thinking to myself, like, damn, he's right.
He put his hand on your shoulder and said, good luck, son.
Well, he basically said, like, hey, you got traded up to be taken in the first round, which is awesome. He's like, think about the difference of, like, when you are drafted by a bad football team, the difference of money you're making when you're drafted at 3, for example, where Joe Thomas is making on that rookie deal, as opposed to what you'll be making at 22. And I'm like, yeah, like there's a lot of truth to that. It's like you don't even get the upside of the pay from being that top 5 pick to a bad organization. like that was basically like what he was pointing out is like LaVar was like, nah, but at least you get the contract. Well, yeah, not in this case. Like not what you were hoping to get.